Hi folks, welcome to the first InSport Education Weekly Seminar. All a little bit crazy at the moment. I've had to shut the curtains behind me because the sun is shining here in Sheffield, and I think one of my friends, Dave Arthur, is online from down under. So I think Sheffield has been as sunny as over there, Dave. What we're going to try and do over the next half an hour or so is just go through some of the key issues that are facing sport, and particularly professional football this week. There's been a huge amount of news with regard to the coronavirus pandemic. It's affecting, it's affecting the world, but it's also affecting those team sport enterprises that we know and love, and we really care for. A number of really smart ideas have come out this week about how we might deal with some of the problems facing sport. And in today's seminar, what we want to do is look at the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on the lower leagues and the kind of things that are going to affect everything that's going on down there. I'm just going to switch off my email account so we don't get any interruptions. So for those of you that don't know who or what InSport is, it's a relatively new organisation, and what we're trying to do is provide a slightly different type of education. Some of that's going to be online, of course, but we also offer opportunities for students to come in and study with us at iconic grounds in London. The intention really is to provide immersive real-world learning for executives and for students, and we're going to try and do that by bringing you some of the big news that's going on in sport over the coming weeks. And the plan we've kind of roughly had is that we'll do this webinar once a week. And on that weekly basis, we can just kind of chill out a little bit and think about how the previous week's gone, look at the big news stories that have happened in sport. I feel like some sort of newsreader because this is the first one we've done, but ultimately what we'll be trying to do is have guests on with us. Some of the people that are already participating in this webinar today may well join us in the coming weeks and look at their areas of expertise, whether that is in social side of sport, whether they're students that are studying sport business management programs. I think there's a couple of my old alumni that have joined us online as well. If you're working in sport, if you're an executive in sport, or you've got a view to be an executive in sport, then just drop us a line and we'll see what we can do. So this pandemic that's gripping the world at the moment is creating some real problems for professional team sport enterprises. I've been asked quite a lot this week about what football in particular needs to do about it. The issue that faces the lower league clubs in particular is that of cash flow. Many of them live what we would call a hand-to-mouth existence in financial terms. Their cash flows are particularly poor, and they're wholly reliant on match day revenues. If you think about how things work in the Premier League, if you think about it as a pyramid like this, the Premier League teams at the very top soak up nearly all of the broadcasting rights deal, and they become dependent on that broadcast rights package. Broadcast revenue makes up the most of their revenue items, if you like, and then sponsorship and commercial revenue is probably the second biggest revenue generator for those Premier League clubs, and matchday revenue tends to be the smallest. And of course, there'll be some variations across the league. You get a really, really big stadium, such as Old Trafford or the new stadium at Tottenham Hotspur. They're going to generate more matchday spend as a consequence of those large stadiums. But proportionally, that revenue is much, much smaller compared to some of those other big revenue streams that they're able to generate. And that means that they're not reliant so much on matchday crowds. And whilst we need crowds in the stadium to produce those fast-flowing, entertaining games for the likes of BT Sport or Sky or any of the other global and international broadcasters of the Premier League, it's that broadcast money that really makes them tick over. Most of the Premier League clubs now, if you look at the latest Deloitte Football Rich list, will make roughly a profit. Pretty much none of them are making any losses. All of them are breaking even and are just about meeting the financial fair play requirements of the European competitions. But as we move down through the league system, the proportion of matchday revenue for each of those clubs as a percentage of their overall turnover becomes much, much bigger, so much, much more important. So take a team down in League Two. It is typical that most of their revenue, probably 70 or even 80% of their revenue, is going to come through matchday ticket receipts. So when this coronavirus pandemic started to hit and started to affect the professional game 2 or 3 weeks ago, we heard a lot about playing games behind closed doors. It's absolutely the worst thing that any football club will have to do if they're operating down through those lower league systems, because without fans going through the gate, paying their ticket money, buying their halftime snacks, buying their programs, and buying some replica kit and that type of thing, cuts off the lifeblood and cuts off that that injection of cash that they get. And of course, if they don't have any of that cash, then they can't pay their players, they can't pay their staff, they can't facilitate their academies, they can't pay the small cafes down the road that might provide some resources on a match day for them. And if you think about this as a kind of football club as a pond, and you're going to drop a stone into that pond, as the ripple effect goes out, you start to affect more and more people. So whilst the football club has been the focus of our attention over the last couple of weeks, and the lack of revenue that particular club has because of the impact that it's having on playing games behind closed doors and a lack of match day revenue, think about all those other businesses in the local area that survive as a consequence of that football club. Think about the bars, the restaurants, the small shops that are built around these stadiums. Think about the communities that those stadiums actually serve and the economic impact that that's going to have on them. So I've been quite fierce in my opposition to playing games behind closed doors. I don't think it was ever the right thing to do. I think you need to be much more pragmatic about a solution. So when the Premier League and the English Football League announced last week that they were going to postpone the season initially for a period of 3 weeks, that should have been music to the ears really of all of those lower league clubs in particular, and actually some of those clubs playing in the Championship, because it ultimately protects, as far as is physically possible, those future revenues that those clubs are going to have. You're not going to have to return any season ticket money at the moment. Your sponsors, your commercial partners, your broadcasters are still going to be able to have that opportunity to have an influence over the game. What we've had this week is an announcement by the English Football League that they're going to provide a relief fund for English Football League clubs, totaling around about 50 million. I'd love to take credit for that particular idea. I did tweet about some ideas about how they could support Football League clubs earlier on in the week, but the EFL beat me to it, I think, and announced on Wednesday that they were going to have this 50 million hardship fund. And that hardship fund is going to support all of those clubs in the Championship, League 1, League 2, and it will support those short-term cash flow positions that they have. So it means they shouldn't have to lay off staff. They should be able to continue paying their casual workers, their part-time workers, and of course those that take out more of the money from the game, whether it's the players, whether it's the executives, and so on in those football clubs. The Premier League, of course, yesterday announced that they were going to, with all of the other leagues. So you had a joint statement from the Premier League, the FA, the English Football League, the Women's Association, the PFA, and the League Managers Association. They were going to suspend the season indefinitely, or rather, they were going to play the season at some point, and they weren't going to worry about when it was going to be played, and that would be no sooner than the 30th of April. And I think if we all look at the news and what's going on at the moment, what we'll see is that it's very unlikely that football is going to restart by May the 1st. But by indefinitely extending the season across all those divisions gives every single club the opportunity to get those games replayed. If you think about the impact just for a moment on not playing those games, they are so far and wide reaching that it's just simply a bad idea. The movement of Euro 2020 to the summer of next year, so it becomes Euro 2021, gives all of these league administrators and the authorities a much bigger opportunity to get their games played. And my personal view is it doesn't matter when those games are played. If it means you have to play in August or September, even the start of October, then that's what needs to happen. Playing those games protects the integrity of each of those divisions. Playing those games means that those lower league clubs are able to recover that match day revenue that they so desperately need to keep themselves afloat financially. We saw this week that Barnet had made redundant all of its staff, put them all on notice. It cited the coronavirus as one of the principal reasons that it was struggling for cash flow. My view on that was that it was fairly opportunistic, that Barnet had many financial issues in the past, and they were really capitalising on this dreadful situation that we're faced with. But what the Barnet situation tells us is that those Football League clubs are really struggling financially, and many of them are on the brink of financial collapse. We heard it last year with with Bury. It nearly happened with Bolton. And through each of those situations, we have been very critical of the league governors, people like the EFL, not supporting those local clubs because of the impact that they have on the local community. And I've read and heard a lot about how certain players that are on multi-million-pound contracts and how clubs that are turning over £500-600 million a year should be helping these clubs. And my position on that is actually it shouldn't be down to those other clubs. It should be down to the league organisers to look after its member organisations. It's easy to sit back and say, this is a free market. You are going to have businesses that survive and fall. But what we forget is that football has that extended reach into society. While sporting success is really important on the field of play, and financial support and success off it will support that sporting performance, we mustn't forget all of the communities that those clubs touch and have an impact on. And that's where the legal authorities really need to step up. They need to step up and make sure that they are decisive in their decision making, that they use themselves and their ability to generate revenue to make sure that those clubs are sustainable and survive. The EFL's made that first step yesterday, or rather on Wednesday of this week, when it talked about the fact that they were going to give this 50 million hardship fund up. Can the EFL really afford that 50 million pound hardship fund? I would argue that whilst they can just about afford it, it's not something that they really should have to do. My view is that the Premier League should be stepping up and saying each club needs to donate 2% of its revenue, of its broadcast revenue rather, to an EFL hardship fund. If every single Premier League club donated 2% of that income that it receives from the likes of BT Sport and Sky and all of its other international broadcast partners, it would generate a fund in the region of 50 or 60 million pounds. It would clear all of the issues that were happening in the Football League system. It would make a real statement to society that the English Premier League had a social conscience and would look after its members. And because the Premier League's not so reliant on these matchday revenues that the lower league clubs are, it can afford to make those concessions. £2 million or £3 million per club is not going to change the face of a Premier League club's financial health. If they donated that 2%, it would give the EFL, the English Football League, a much broader opportunity to have an impact right the way down the system. So we could go beyond just the Football League. We could go into the national leagues. We could go into the grassroots leagues. My own son's football club has had to call off its training. Do we stop parents paying their monthly subscriptions? Because if we do that, some of the coaches that we use from some of our private providers aren't going to get paid. So the economic consequences of some of the actions that we're starting to see across the sporting landscape, and particularly in football, reach far wider than playing a game behind closed doors. I think it's really important that we see more action next week. I think that the UEFA statements and the FIFA statements that have demonstrated that they're going to try and be flexible with clubs, they're going to try and give them some more leeway is really important. And lots of people ask questions. What about player contracts? Most player contracts will finish on the 30th of June. That's a really simple equation for me. You speak to the player and their agent and you make sure that they deliver what they had originally signed up for. What they originally signed up for is to play a full season in the respective club or division they're in. And if that means they have to take some sort of salary sacrifice to make sure they can play for that 12 months, they should do that. Because if you truncate next year's season, they're still going to earn the season amount of money just over a slightly shorter period of time. For me, there's plenty of time to get this season finished. We could then start next season, whether that's in October or November, and we could still finish that season in advance of the European Championships that have been rescheduled for next year. Some people say that means you can't go on a Far East tour or a summer tour, and that's going to cost clubs millions. But when you look at all the budgets that get put into those summer tours and those pre-season tours, they don't actually generate a huge amount of money. I think Manchester United generated somewhere in the region of about £10 million from its latest tour to North America. £10 million to Manchester United isn't a huge deal. Now, of course, there will be other consequences of that. They will be able to sign up commercial partners, new sponsorship arrangements. They gain market position. But maybe they should be thinking differently over the coming months about how they gain that market position if that's important. Could quite easily finish the season at a much later point, take a short break for those players just to recover before you then start the following season. You might need to extend the transfer window. You might need to say that the transfer window extends into the start of the playing season, or indeed just truncate it. Most clubs, I'm sure, are going to be using this time to think about how they're going to how they're going to develop for the coming season. Having an impact on those smaller clubs in the lower leagues is really, really vital. We've got to find out a way, or work out a way, of making sure that those revenues are protected. So I'm just going to nip into the question box now and see who's asking for what. Hey Sartak, how are you? So Sartak's asked me a question. I'm not sure if you guys can see the question and answer box, so I'll read it out anyway, and if you can, then someone can write in the chat box next door, or I'll speak to the guys back at HQ. Sartak's question is about a paper that I've put together on parachute payments. Any of you that followed some of my work know that I'm really, really unhappy with the parachute payment situation, and perhaps what we'll do is have another webinar on the impact of parachute payments directly. But Sartak talks about the English Premier League handing out 270 million rather every year in parachute payments. Would that have been better if they contributed the same equally to all EFL clubs, which would have made life a bit easier in the long run? It's not a bad shout. So let's unpack parachute payments in a later webinar. But they're absolutely clear to me that the Premier League doesn't do enough for the rest of the league system. Each year, the Premier League generates around about £3 billion worth of revenue for itself through broadcast rights, ostensibly. That broadcast money filters down through the league system through what the league call solidarity payments and parachute payments. Those solidarity payments for the whole Football League system total somewhere in the region of about 150 million. Now, don't quote me on that, and I know we're recording, but it's somewhere in the order of 150 million. So each club in the Championship will earn around about 7 or 8 million. Each club in the Championship, in League One rather, around about 4 million, and each club in League Two, around about £500,000 to £1 million, something in that order. The Premier League retains £2.5 billion of that deal each year. It distributes that, of course, to its member clubs, and they become very, very powerful. But Sartak's question makes a really important point. The Premier League can afford, and really should afford, a little bit more money to drop through the system, because ultimately those Premier League clubs are sucking the audience figures away from some of those other clubs. Now, critics of that argument might say, well, you know, it's free market. There are what we've got now 91 clubs, because Bury got expelled last year. There are always going to be winners and losers. Some clubs are going to get bigger. Some clubs will naturally be a little bit smaller. But what is the problem in actually delivering some of that revenue a little bit further down? It doesn't take a lot. This 2% idea that I think Dan has just mentioned on the question and answer box, this 2% idea does not make a tangible difference to those Premier League clubs. It would give all of the Football League a real shot in the cash flow arm, if you like, and allow them to become much more sustainable as entities, at least in the short term. And I'm not advocating here that donations to those League One, League Two clubs, some Championship clubs from their Premier League counterparts is the way that you should run a business model. In the same way that I don't think owners should really invest tens of millions or hundreds of millions of pounds in the sustaining of their clubs. What I advocate is that clubs should be run as financially sound going concerns. They should continue to trade over the course of the year. They should do the best they possibly can with the resources at their disposal. In that system, you will always get winners and losers, but each club within it will always be sustainable and will be able to have the impact that they do on their home communities and the reach that they provide. So Sartak, I hope that answers your question ever so slightly. Right, Dan's got a question. So agrees with the idea of the 2% TV revenue being donated, but surely the broadcasters are going to try and claw back some of the broadcast rights fees they had paid due to the disruption of the season. Absolutely right, Dan. What we're expecting, or what I'm expecting, is that all of those broadcasters will say, will be looking and will try and influence the Premier League and the associated leagues around it, that if they aren't able to complete the season, that they are given a refund, if you like, on some of the money that they've already paid for games that haven't been broadcast. It's going to have a huge impact on their subscriber numbers. And there's a load of data that's emerging this week that is suggesting that people are leaving those pay TV subscription platforms in their droves. So cancelling their Sky Sports subscriptions, their BT Sports subscriptions, their Virgin Media packages, and so on. And that's because most of the rationale for buying pay TV and having a digital broadcaster in your home is so that you can stream live sport. It's around about 50% of the population's key motivation for having Sky Television is so that they can watch live sport. And of that 50%, around about 70% of those are buying it to watch and consume professional football. So it stands to reason, therefore, that if you can't produce those games and you're going to lose those subscribers, those pay TV providers are going to try and make sure that they don't have to pay the Premier League the sorts of money that it has been in the past. And we heard this week there was a Norwegian broadcaster that had already refused to pay the Premier League for the international rights that it wasn't able to activate as a consequence of the postponing of the season. And this is where I'll come back to the importance of that indefinite extension to the season, that objective that the relative authorities have come out with to suggest that they absolutely want the season to be finished. It protects so much revenue, not just the revenue that's on offer through those match day ticket receipts, but it protects that sponsorship and commercial revenue, and it protects that broadcast revenue. Without those revenues, the issues that we've talked about loosely today around those League One and League Two clubs having their lifeblood taken out of them through match day ticket receipts, so too would we see a problem at the Premier League. If the broadcasters pull out, and I think when we did some calculations earlier on this week, there's around about £700 million of unallocated Premier League TV money, if you like. So games that are yet to be played are worth around about £700 million. If that 700 million is taken out of the Premier League budgets, the same issues that we're seeing in League One and League Two will manifest themselves at the Premier League level. There will be clubs in the Premier League that have budgeted for all of that TV income. It is guaranteed. They should be able to. Budget for that. I don't think it's unsensible to do so. So if you take out that revenue, it's going to cause those Premier League clubs a real cash flow challenge, I think. And maybe Alexis Sanchez won't get his additional wages from Manchester United while he's on loan into Milan. Hi Dan, how are you doing? I've got a question from Dan Parnell. Should the Premier League 19-20 season be finished regardless of how long it takes? Asking from the blue side of Merseyside. Dan, listen, I think absolutely the season needs to be finished regardless of how long it takes. If that means we're playing this current season through to Christmas, then I think my vote would be to see that through. And it links to all that revenue generation stuff that we've just talked about, of course. Finishing that season is absolutely vital. I also think it has an impact on the whole integrity of the competition itself. That if you stop a season midway through or 3/4 of the way through, you're going to get so many winners and losers in that context. Look at our local club, Sheffield United, for example, just about teetering on the edge of a potential Champions League spot, given the situation we've got with Manchester City. If they're not able to complete the season and really try and get that position, how does that make them feel? How would Liverpool really feel if they won the Premier League by default because the season was cancelled, because they haven't officially got the number of points they're required to do? I think it just takes some of the gloss off that type of thing. And over on the blue side of Merseyside, of course, Everton need to pick up their playing performances and see if they can finish the season strongly and make sure they can generate a little bit more from the TV revenue as they go through. I hope that answers your question, Dan. And I know you're always a blue. Okay, Dan, another Dan. Is now a time to allow B teams like in Spain so more clubs can stay afloat? Let me say that again without something in my mouth. Is now a time to allow B teams like in Spain so that more clubs can stay afloat? It's a good idea, but I think what's so unique about the English football system is if you compare it to the American model for team sports, what you have in the UK is this highly concentrated number of teams in a very, very small territory. So we've got 91, 92 professional clubs playing in our game that are able to pull and have those community impacts, and they extend so wide into that community. And just go back up to Dan Parnell's point now. Community programme at Everton Football Club at the moment are getting some fabulous press because of the work they're doing in and around Merseyside in reducing things like gun and knife crime. No one else is doing that work. So the football club has taken a position to try and influence it and to try and do something better. And that's what we get from our community clubs. They are embedded to the communities that they exist in. You go over to America, you have this kind of franchise arrangement whereby clubs are ported sometimes and dropped in wherever they need to be, and you lack that community cohesion and that real impact beyond that professional game. I think having a B team idea works from the point of view of the actual club. So if you had a Manchester City B team, it is naturally going to be given more resources from the A side. It is naturally going to be able to progress up through the leagues. But it makes me question then what the point is of our league system. And whilst that it would be helpful for those professional entities in their own right, and it would support things like a Manchester United or a Manchester City or a Liverpool or an Everton brand, it doesn't really encourage what we need to see at the bottom end of the system, where the real important work gets done in the communities that those football clubs have an impact in. Okay, Sartak's come back on to the chat. Oh, here we go. Questions are flowing now. Oh, hang on, this might have just popped back up. Here we go. Going back to the last question about B teams, aren't Premier League clubs potentially participating against League One and League Two clubs through their B teams in the leasing.com trophy? Yeah, I suppose they are in the EFL trophy. There have already been a resistance from the EFL clubs regarding this. I think it's fair. Those big Premier League teams are not there to dominate the rest of football. They are there to try and develop as much sporting progress as they possibly can, and they do that in a financially sound way with any luck. I'm really anti having those B teams dropping into the system, because I think it takes away the very fabric of what the game is all about. So a Manchester City B team playing my home team, Cheltenham Town, it's just David versus Goliath. And whilst you might want to see that in some competitions, I don't think it's really fair on the development of those lower league teams to see organisations like that drop in. So Mohar's in, given the tight cash in lower leagues and also the fact that some lower clubs in lower leagues operate on annual losses already, don't they just? What happens to the promotion relegation if the season has to be cancelled come what may? This is one of the reasons why I think it's so important to finish the season. Understanding how to promote and relegate teams at this point in time is going to be increasingly difficult, and there are going to be too many winners and losers. Just look at what Karen Brady said on Saturday, opportunistically saying, void the season right now. Those clubs that are in the relegation zone go down. The ones that are in the promotion places come up. Lo and behold, West Ham United are above the relegation zone. I think there's too much self-interest in that, and we can't, with any real sense of security, say that finishing a season without playing the games is going to lead to the right result. And FIFA have done some modelling on this, and I don't even think the modelling works in any way. I think the principal objective, the prime objective, has to be finish the season, irrespective of how that happens. Can the deadline of the 30th of June be extended? My position on that is yes. I think there are some legal implications of player contracts, but I think what we are starting to see is a much more collaborative approach right the way through the league system, and I would expect to see that come through players as well. We've already heard of some really high-profile players giving their hotels over to things like the NHS. So I think the support is there to try and do something differently. Right, I'm just running through the chat box. It's jumping around a little bit for me. So Izzy's jumped in. If the season doesn't finish, should the season ticket holders be partially refunded, or will this have more of a detrimental effect? So if we look at what we've talked about, those low league clubs are absolutely dependent on that revenue. And in many ways, that season ticket revenue that has already come in, they will have budgeted for and will currently be using to pay back the or to one of the contracts that they've got set up at the club. I think the reality is, though, if the season did get cancelled, season ticket holders would have as much of a claim on things as some of these sponsors and commercial partners and broadcasters to say, you sold me 40 games this season, I've only consumed 30, I'd like a 25% return on my season ticket. That would lead to an absolute financial bedlam right the way through the system. You would argue that the fans, those season ticket holders, have the right to that revenue, so probably should be given it back. It would really, really destabilise the system. Okay, there was just a little bit extra on Moha's question, which was, would feel sorry for clubs like Leeds or West Brom if they lose out on promotion because of the Premier League money pool, massive money pool. Do you know the problem with Leeds United is they've already publicly declared that they are right up on the limits of financial fair play. So if they don't get promoted, then they're likely to be sanctioned by the EFL next year for overspending. So more questions then get unpacked around that type of thing. And I think what we'll do is we'll try and set a webinar up on the impact of FFP and the impact of regulation in this context specifically, so we can unpick some of those ideas. Some of those clubs down in the Championship will be absolutely desperate to finish their seasons. James, one of the major arguments keeping the transfer system in its current form is the supposed trickle-down effect, i.e. the transfer fees allow revenue to go from top to bottom in football. If coronavirus means that revenue is distributed down the pyramid in a more equitable way, could this lead to a permanent rethink once this crisis is over? I'm expecting there to be a big impact on the transfer market. We're expecting fees to come down as clubs try and do their business at the end of the season, whenever that will be. I'm not so sure how those transfer fees really trickle down, unless it's through Premier League clubs buying lower league players and having to pay a slight premium for that. But we tend to see more of the television deal go out of the Premier League into other European countries, actually. So European counterparts charging much higher fees for that. And then James, just finishing off, or is that too hopeful, and instead money may be distributed down the pyramid now, but then big clubs will sweep up the star players of desperate lower league teams at bargain prices when the transfer window opens? That is absolutely the danger. What I'd like to see is the Premier League unequally distributing its TV rights, actually, so giving bigger shares to those clubs that are towards the bottom of the Premier League, and that would help something called competitive balance, which again we'll pick up in another webinar. If we're able to do that, then I think that we can stabilise the transfer system through those lower league teams. I think the biggest danger of what we're currently seeing is that if some of those teams are very, very weak financially and are really struggling with their cash flow, then some of these bigger clubs are going to really exploit that situation and try and pick players up much cheaper, or leverage players out of those clubs when they really ought not to do that. Okay, keep on moving down. I know we're slightly over our allotted time, but you know, you're all asking questions and I haven't got anything better to do today. So Matthew's asked, in the case of the league ending before completion, what do you think of the idea of expanded playoffs? Those in the Premier League relegation zone playing against top Championship sides in a Magic Weekend style. It would surely bring a lot of much needed revenue, be a great fan experience and a fair way of concluding the Premier League season. As an opportunity, as an idea to finish the season in a way without playing all the games, I think that is probably the most realistic. I think bringing all those teams together to play those games would drive some real TV interest. I think it would drive some real sponsorship interest and some real commercial partner interest, and that the money could be recovered in that particular way. I was on a phone-in on Wednesday on BBC Radio Sheffield, and one of the callers phoned in and talked about how they might move to playing games behind closed doors, because he'd heard about how critical I was about that. And he said, why don't TV broadcasters provide an online digital platform for every single team that is playing behind closed doors to go online? So as a season ticket holder or as a fan, you can go online, watch your team's game, and you pay for the privilege of doing that, £5 or £6. All of that money then goes into the clubs that are participating in that particular game as a way of protecting some of that match day spend, which I thought was a really nice idea. Sartak, I might come back to you in a minute, because I know we've talked a couple of questions, and Jonas has got one. How are club sponsors reacting to this situation? Have you seen any examples? Do you think they will try and get compensations? We haven't had any formal examples of where a sponsor is now lobbying very hard against a club to get out of their deal. On the grapevine and on the network, we're starting to pick up issues where sponsors are doing exactly that and really challenging some of those, particularly the really, really big clubs on the big sponsorship deals, how they might renegotiate some of those opportunities. So it's absolutely being talked about. Compensation is slightly different to non-payment of those original fees, but they're absolutely being talked about, and we'll probably hear some more. The biggest high-profile example that we have seen is that Norwegian TV company that is now refusing to pay the next wave of payment for broadcast of the English Premier League while they wait to see what happens. And that's all about them protecting their own cash flow, which you would expect other clubs will do in the same way. Right, Sartak, I'm going to come back to you, and if it's all right with everybody, unless I get told otherwise, we'll make this the last question for this particular webinar. So will this coronavirus effect actually negate some of the impacts which inflated the mid-level transfer fees after the Neymar deal, or will the gap grow bigger because of this? My genuine feeling is that we will see a slowdown of the transfer market as a consequence of what we're seeing. As players aren't able to play, as they're not able to go into that shop window of Euro 2020, which would always give the transfer market a bit of a spike, I think we will naturally see a slowdown of some of those transfer fees. The Neymar deal certainly reset the bar in terms of where some football clubs were prepared to go for their transfers. But what we also need to remember about the Neymar deal is it wasn't a transfer fee in the traditional sense. It was a buyout clause. So in order to execute that player trade, they had to buy the player contract out at about 200 million euros. That's a big deal. And it made club executives look at it and see it as a new ceiling. But I never think it really was a genuine transfer. So I think the one I always looked at in that particular or at that particular time was the one of Coutinho when he moved from Liverpool to Barcelona for around about 142. I think that's where the bar was essentially reset. And of course, clubs have backed off, haven't they, of spending those really big fees, and it's trying to. I guess it's pulled up the £50 million transfers to around about 70 or 80 million, but no one really seems to want to go through that 100 million mark. As we've just heard from Moha there. So I know we're a little bit over time. Hopefully, I think everybody stayed online actually. So this was our first test. I hope it's gone okay. It's been a little bit stunted at times, but I think we've covered some really good stuff. Please just keep an eye on the social media channels. We've got our InSport LinkedIn account. We've got our InSport Twitter feed. What we would really like to do is just bring this community of people with sporting interest together. Give us a platform to have a little bit of a discussion about some of those things that are really grabbing hold of your mind, and try and get us away from some of this craziness. So I hope you enjoyed it. Some good comments coming down the chat box, and I will see you again next week.